Okay, good afternoon. Today I'm going to be guest lecturing for you guys. Hopefully less lecture and more fun than that, but we're going to be talking about checks and balances in American politics. So as I understand it, you guys have spent the last several weeks talking about different institutions in American government, different branches of government, the presidency, Congress, and the judiciary. Today we're going to kind of bring all of those things that you've learned together and say who really has power in American government. So first we're going to review some key concepts on checks and balances. Then we'll talk about what the role of media is in American government. This is something I know is new. You guys haven't talked about the media a whole lot yet. But I think it has a really important role to play, and I kind of want to bring it into the conversation about what different branches of government are doing. Then we're going to apply some of the checks and balances to the Affordable Care Act, and then we'll do a group activity to talk about which is the most powerful branch of government. So let's start with kind of the key question of the day. Who really makes public policy? Right? We've learned a lot of different branches of government. All of them have different powers and authorities given to them, but they all also have some weaknesses. And so when it comes to we have some law, we have something that we want to have passed, who is it that really has the authority to do that? Or who is it that really has the most influence over what happens? So let's start with a review, this should be a review, of the separation of powers. So back in the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution divided authority in government among many branches. So they gave the power to make judgments on law to the judiciary, the power to put law into action, or the power to execute law, to the executive branch, and the power to make and change laws to the legislature, or the legislative power. But it's not as nice and clean as that, right? We know that. Then they took a little bit of each of those powers and gave it to another branch, just to make sure that nobody got, too big for their britches. Excuse the expression. Just to make sure that nobody got too powerful and overran the other branches, they gave a little bit of that authority, a little bit of what they needed to do to accomplish their task to another branch of government. So we have the executive branch. They get to nominate federal judges, which gives them a little bit of power over the judicial branch. The judicial branch, in turn, can declare acts of the executive unconstitutional. So the executive often rules with executive orders or regulatory decisions, and the judicial branch can weigh in and say, can't do that, and rule it unconstitutional, in which case it loses all force. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional from the legislature, but the legislature can also appoint or reject judicial nominations. So they have some authority over who's making those decisions in exchange for the judicial branch having kind of the final say in the constitutionality of laws. Then we get the executive branch. The executive branch can veto laws made by the legislature. You have to have the president's signature for a law to go into power. And the president gets the ability to veto it. So the legislative branch, in order to make laws, has to have some buy-in from the executive. We get the legislative branch gets to override the executive's veto with a 2/3 majority. That's difficult to accomplish, but they can do it. They can also reject judicial nominations. So most of this is straight from your textbook, right? It should be review, hopefully helpful for your midterm coming up. But we also government's changed a lot since the Constitution was written, right? And so you guys have learned a lot of other things about these branches of government, and I'd like to kind of update our conversation a little bit and say, what's really going on today? They still have all of these powers, but there are other ways that these branches of government interact. One of the things that is not really seen in the Constitution is the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, right? The Constitution gives the executive branch the power to execute the laws, whatever that means, whatever that takes. In practice, that means the executive branch gets to hire a lot of people to go and make sure that laws are actually implemented the way the legislature intended. This results in a growth of this huge bureaucracy, right? Here's a bunch of different seals of federal government organizations. This happens at the federal level, at the state level. There are lots of people employed in the business of making sure that laws actually happen on the ground after they're passed by the legislature. But who oversees the bureaucracy? So here's where, hopefully you did the reading for today. Here's where we get this McCubbins and Schwartz short piece that you had to read, right? So we have congressional oversight of the bureaucracy. Ideally, the bureaucracy is implementing laws in the way in which the legislature intends. Whether that always happens or not is sort of questionable. And in some cases, the legislature is intentionally vague. They give a direction and say this is what we think the law should be, but they don't really spell out all of the details. So McCubbins and Schwartz really think about what's the role of Congress, the legislative branch, in overseeing the bureaucracy, which is part of the executive branch, right? So here we're seeing another interaction between these two branches of government. And who's really making the public policy. So they use two analogies. The first one is the police patrol. Can somebody tell me what that means? Let's see if we did some reading. Yes, thank you.
So the police patrol, from what I understand, is if a legislative branch, for example, passes a law, it's them sort of policing it themselves, like making sure that everything's on track and running smoothly.
Who's them?
The legislators.
Yes, that's exactly it. So it's the legislators actively monitoring, a sample, some set of what the bureaucracy is doing to make sure that they're really doing the job. Can somebody tell me what the fire alarm person was? Yes, thanks.
The legislators wait for their constituents or special interest groups to signal to them that there needs to be some oversight.
Fantastic, yes. You guys did the reading. Yeah, that's exactly it. So we have these two models of how a legislature might oversee what's going on in a bureaucracy. Which one do McCubbins and Schwartz say that it actually is? The fire alarm, right. So if we're expecting the Congress to oversee the implementation of laws by, meticulously paying attention to every detail, that's not what's happening. But they still have some influence because they're instituting checks or processes by which citizens or interest groups or other people can raise an alarm if things aren't going how they want. And in that case, it might go to the judicial branch. Maybe they'll file a lawsuit and say this isn't working how it's supposed to, in which case the judicial branch will arbitrate. Or they may come directly to the legislature, and the legislature will clarify with additional laws or by maybe taking away the funding from an agency that isn't behaving how they'd like. So they have lots of levers to kind of respond when the executive branch isn't behaving how they want. All right, so we still see a little bit of control here. Let's take an example of fire alarm oversight. And part of this is good because it'll segue us nicely into the media conversation. So as fuzzy as that is, here we have a headline from a newspaper that says, John Oliver's rant about net neutrality crashes the FCC site. Does anybody know the history of this? Does anybody watch John Oliver? I see some hesitant hands raising. That's probably okay because John Oliver is not always the most friendly of language of any show that you're going to watch.
He's British, though.
He's British, so it's okay. Right, so a little bit of the background. Net neutrality is a policy that the FCC instituted that said all internet providers have to treat all information that's coming across the internet the same way. So for example, if Google is providing your internet, as that might be the case for many of you here in Provo, they can't slow down maybe streaming content from some of their competitors like Amazon or Netflix. They have to treat Google's information that's coming across the internet in exactly the same way that they treat all of their competitors' information that's coming across the network. You can imagine why Google might want to slow things down, right, for some of the competitors, because if you're getting Google Internet, then maybe you get Google Play and you're using their services too. So the FCC has a policy that establishes net neutrality. It's overruled in the courts, and the chairman of the FCC starts working on some new regulations. And those get leaked. And John Oliver finds out about them, and they leave some room for internet providers to treat different data differently. He's not happy about this. He goes on last week tonight. Is that? Yeah. Thanks. See, more of you knew what his show was called than admitted to watching it. So he goes on Last Week Tonight. He calls out for all of the trolls of the internet to go and comment on the regulatory rule, because that's another sort of check as organizations in the bureaucracy want to implement new regulations. They're generally left for an open public comment period so that they can get feedback from people or interest groups on what's going on. And the Crash the FCC site has huge outreach. And this is kind of an example of this kind of fire alarm system, right? something was happening that may not have been in line with the legislature's intent, it may not have been what people wanted, and so he raised a fire alarm. Lots of people responded, and eventually we get regulations that keep net neutrality. The current chairman of the FCC is not as supportive of net neutrality, so keep an eye out and keep listening to John Oliver. He'll issue continued calls.
I think he actually already did.
He did. Yeah, he did. Still have net neutrality, but keep an ear on. Okay, so that brings us to sort of the next piece of the conversation, right? So John Oliver is part of the media and is making this call and influencing public policy in a big way. But he's not part of government, right? He's not one of those three branches mentioned in the Constitution. So today I'd like to bring in the fourth estate. The fourth estate is a phrase drawn from sort of more European conceptions of government, but in the United States we usually take that to mean that the media is kind of like a fourth branch of government. That they influence what happens in government, and that what happens in government influences the media. So here's where we get to your next reading. What's the democratic role of the media? So Schutzen says that democracy does not necessarily produce journalism, nor does journalism necessarily produce democracy. Where there is democracy, however, or where there are forces prepared to bring it about, journalism can provide a number of different services to help establish or sustain representative government. Right? So they're not necessarily connected, but we do have a democratic role of the media. And he gives several examples of this. The first one is information. The media can provide information that enables citizens to make informed decisions. The next is investigation. This is the watchdog role of media. So media, like John Oliver, can keep an eye out and say, hey, somebody in government is doing something that we don't like, and you should pay attention. So the idea here is they prevent bad things from happening. They prevent outcomes we don't like. They sound a fire alarm. They can also provide analysis. So oftentimes, the issues and the policies that are up for debate in government are very complex. And the media can help people understand the meaning of complex events and how they relate to their lives or to the broader political system. So kind of the arcane procedural things that might be happening in Congress, media can provide the analysis to help people understand what that actually means. They provide social empathy. This is one that is an idea that's pretty unique to Schutzen. He admits that. But part of the idea is that it's awareness of and compassion for others who might not be like you. So you might not understand the reason for some policy or for some argument or for something that government's doing, but it might matter a lot to somebody somewhere else in the country who has a different background than you. And so media can help you understand different life circumstances of different people and generate a sense of social empathy and community in the United States for people who you may never actually come in contact with in real life. It can also be a public forum. So it allows many people to provide commentary on political issues. Here he's talking specifically about newspapers. Opinion sections of newspapers can allow people to give really well-reasoned, or at least lengthy, arguments about their positions and allow us to kind of debate several ideas all at once. Social media is also a forum for this, right? Where lots of people are sharing their opinions in a way that is accessible to a lot of the to a broader audience than they would normally have access to. It also serves a really important mobilization role. So it can rally like-minded citizens to a cause. Where lots of people care about something, media can alert them that, hey, you need to be paying attention and you need to be active on this issue. Right? So a lot of what media does is pay attention to government and translate that into to the public. And so media has a lot of power because it has access to the constituent base that of political decision makers. Okay, so next let's take a look at the application to the Affordable Care Act. So I gave you a short reading by Norm Ornstein, who's a political scientist who studies Congress, about sort of the history of the Affordable Care Act. And we're going to spend a little less time on the partisan breakdown of, which people in Congress did what at what time. But in there he mentions all of these different branches of government and some part of the role that they played in the Affordable Care Act. So I'm going to put up here some key events in the timeline of the Affordable Care Act. I'd like you guys to kind of give me some idea of what branch of government we're looking at, what kinds of powers they had at that time. So what is it that lets them actually influence what's happening with the Affordable Care Act, and what kinds of things what kind of limitations they faced at that point in time. So first we have Obama. He campaigns through 2008 for the policy. He makes it a top priority while he's in office. So what branch of government are we talking about? Yes. And what powers does he have, or what limitations does he face in actually getting the Affordable Care Act to a real policy, to an enacted policy? Yes?
The power he has is the bully pulpit, the media's attention.
Good, excellent. He's gotten a lot of attention over the course of the campaign. Good.
Limitation is that he can't actually make policy as president.
That's a huge limitation, isn't it? Right, so he's spent a lot of time getting public support, but he can't actually pass the law. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, even though he can't pass the law, he can still, he has like a huge team of policy staff that can still write up the law. It's just Congress that has to pass it.
Good, excellent. And he did a lot of work with Congress to make sure that, his priorities and what Congress wanted were lining up in a very strategic way. Good. So Congress eventually passes the policy. What does Congress have going for it? Obviously, this is the legislative branch. I won't put you through that again. What does Congress have going for it, and what are its limitations at this point? Yeah.
I mean, it can actually write up the legislation and get it passed.
Good.
So.
Yes, that's what it did. It actually passed a real law that then was on the books and enacted.
And it was limited by the members of Congress, though, too, in forming a large enough coalition to actually get it through.
Good, excellent. So they face a huge limitation in the partisan conflict. That's a major emphasis of this article. But also this, the division of labor between the houses in Congress, right? There's a lot of back and forth between the House and Senate, and that matters a lot. The bicameral legislature really slows things down a lot in this process. Good. Anything else? Great. Oh, yes, we do have more.
I was just going to say that even though they passed it, there were a lot of, moving parts to the legislation, and so even though it was technically law, it was still not really able to walk on its own just quite yet.
Good, excellent.
And also kind of going back to the members of Congress, they're also limited by their political parties and party leadership. In the article it talked about how there were Republicans working with Democrats on the plan, but then Mitch McConnell said stop that, and they had to do it, otherwise the Republican Party would full support for re-election.
Good, excellent. So we see a lot of partisan conflict, and even the decision that individual members of Congress are having to make is limiting how this can move forward. Good. So then we get to the president signs the policy and we begin implementation, which is exactly this point. Who's responsible for the policy at this point? Yeah, the executive branch, right? The president signs it into law, and then the executive branch, or the bureaucracy, is supposed to be implementing it. What are some powers and some limitations we have at this point? Yes?
One of the limitations is federalism, because a lot of the state governors said it was unconstitutional and they wouldn't put it in their own state. So.
Good, excellent. That is exactly one of the limitations.
They also had to deal with the issue of funding, because Congress refused to fund law, then it's pretty much dead in the water. And so if you're not able to keep House of Representatives or control Congress, it'll be really hard to keep it afloat.
Good. So this is an excellent example of another one of those checks and balances, right? Even if the executive branch wants to implement something, Congress can fund it, and if they don't have enough funding, it's not really going to happen on the ground. Good. Excellent.
Where you could have a principal agent problem are the bureaucracies implementing it the way that the president wants it to be done.
Good. Excellent. You guys have learned about principal agent problems. This is a great example of one. Good. What else? Yes?
The limitation where, not everything Congress says is forever,
Good.
They brought it up to the Supreme Court,
We will get to that next bullet point. Yeah.
They have to maintain some allegiance to the media and their constituents, or not their constituents, but the general public. Just because, what we talked about with Newsnet net neutrality, there can be some pushback against that.
Great. Excellent. So next we get to the Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court hears a case on the constitutionality of the individual mandate. This is NFIB versus Sibelius, and upholds the Affordable Care Act. So at this point, when the Supreme Court is hearing the case, which branch of government has the most influence? Judicial branch. Good. Excellent. So what are some powers it has and what are some limitations it has?
It defines laws as constitutional or unconstitutional.
Good. So it has all of the authority right in this moment to say whether this law is going to happen or not. Good.
They don't have any way to enforce their ruling. It has to be enforced by the executive branch
Good.
or Congress.
Exactly. Yes. Good. That's a really important limitation. Yeah.
They have to work based on past precedent as well.
Yeah. So they're limited to the text of the laws and to past precedent and what other courts have found in the past. Good. It can't just do whatever it wants. It does have some limitation. It's beholden to the text here. That's good. Again, the executive branch begins implementation. Many states don't set up state insurance exchanges, so we already talked about federalism. That's a big problem here for the executive branch. We have not only divided power among the branches of government, but we've also divided it across layers of government. So we have the federal government, the state governments, and local governments who may or may not comply with what's going on here. And this leads to another court case where where the claim is that for people who bought insurance on the national exchanges instead of the state exchanges, the law doesn't specifically say that they actually get the subsidies from the federal government. So this, again, goes back to the Supreme Court. Very similar to the last case, we have the Supreme Court holding the authority here about whether this law is going to continue to be enacted. And again, the Supreme Court sides with the Affordable Care Act. Through all of this, and one of the things I liked in the article you read, through all of this, there's a lot of influence of the media, right? So here's what Norm Ornstein says about it. He says, at the same time, the overheated rhetoric, reinforced by conservative talk radio, cable television, blogs, and social media, has created a visceral backlash. It's kept every Republican presidential candidate calling for root and branch repeal of every element of Obamacare. Have we heard something about repeal and replace lately? So we see a lot of media influence and also public opinion and what people are expecting from this policy and how they're, what the support is moving forward and what kinds of tactics are going to work in campaigns for politicians moving forward. So the media has a big role in all of this too. Okay, let's go to our group activity. Woo! I gave you too much of a preview here. Okay, I need everybody to take the card. What we're going to do is get into groups. So if you have a spade, you're going to talk about the legislative branch. If you have a club, you're going to talk about the judicial branch, diamonds executive branch, and hearts media. So I want you to get in your groups, and for about 10 to 12 minutes, I want you to come up with every reason why this branch of government is the most powerful branch of government. And you should anticipate some arguments, some counter-arguments. Think about how it can overcome limitations that are placed on that branch of government. Okay, our time's up. Yoo-hoo. Great. Time's up. Do we all have spectacular cases for why your branch of government is best?
Wow.
We good? This is so awesome. You got it? Okay, here's what we're going to do next. Part 2. Now you're going to get in new groups by number. So that will be one person from each group. And as a group, you need to come to a decision about which branch of government is most powerful. So make your case. Figure it out.
Are we still committed to our government?
That's up to you. You as a group need to make a collective decision about which branch of government is most powerful. Are you guys good where you are? Do you want to go back to your original seats, or are you happy where you're at? We're good? Okay, we'll stay where we're at. You all seem happy. Let's talk about it. So let's start with the legislature. So we've got 2 groups that voted for the legislature. Tell me some of your arguments about why the legislature is the most powerful branch. What was like the winning argument in your group? Yeah.
The budget. Legislature controls the budget, and where money is, that's where power is.
Okay, that's a great argument. What was yours?
So we were very divided. But whenever
Are you saying there was a collective action problem?
it was a testy collective action. But whenever we all came back to like the legislative could check it, it's like no matter what, the legislative had some kind of check over the other branch.
Okay, so like, give me some examples.
So we talked about, I don't know, like Supreme Court appointments that although he would appoint it, that the legislature could still turn it down, and like there's no constitutional amendment saying how many Supreme Court justices there should be, so like they could turn them down until they all died off. So.
Okay.
That's escalated really
Thanks for that suggestion.
You can just get rid of the judicial branch by just not appointing anyone. Wow, yeah, this took a really turn for the strategic here. Okay. What, for those of you who didn't pick the legislature, what were some of your responses to these arguments?
Oh, well, I think the thing is that with legislature, the president sets their agenda in a lot of ways, and the president can, even if he can't like completely go against their policy, he can usually gridlock them and to make them. There's just so much infighting.
So you think that like the threat of a legislative veto can make Congress kind of fall into line? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like if Congress were to like everyone unite on some big issue, it could beat the president, but that doesn't really happen. So.
Okay, great.
Well, there are these like inter-branch checks on the legislature, obviously, but I think the greatest issue is just the coordination problems within it, and that's just something
Okay.
that is a real issue.
Okay, so you're not seeing a solution to partisan division and division between chambers. You're saying that that is such a big problem that the legislature loses all of its power.
I mean, not all of it.
Not all of it, but it becomes not the most powerful. Okay, great.
So as a group, we democratically came to about the
Good work.
legislature being the most important branch, but something that we did talk about and acknowledge was that, like an analogy, that the legislative branch is kind of like the kid that has like all the talent in the world, but like it's a question of whether or not he like shows up to classes, and shows up to practice.
So true.
Okay, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the judicial branch. Who picked there's a group for the judicial branch. Why is the judicial branch the most powerful? Yeah.
I mean, they can basically declare anything that Congress puts out or the president does unconstitutional. It's sort of like the end-all, be-all of law. I mean, the judicial branch interprets the Constitution, which is like the highest law of the land, and so they get to decide what the highest law of the land is, and that applies to all branches of government and the whole country.
Okay, that's a pretty powerful argument. What do we have to say about that? Yeah.
Except for the Constitution can be changed. Example, income tax was always declared unconstitutional until they changed the Constitution and said that's straight up constitutional. So.
We've got a rebuttal.
We can declare those changes unconstitutional.
Yeah.
It's part of the Constitution.
I think you can't declare constitutional amendments unconstitutional. But every other law, sure. Oh yeah, now what are we going to do? Okay, yeah.
I think a strong argument in favor of the judicial branch is just like when you look back on the past 50 years, like a lot of the most important legislative decisions that have been made have actually been made by the judicial branch on gay marriage, on gender equality, on so many different things. It was the judicial branch that like actually made it happen after just years of infighting within Congress.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd say that those might not necessarily be the actual most important decisions, but they might be what the media has like.
So should we move on to the media?
Yeah, that's like what's given attention.
Okay, let's talk about the media then. Who picked the media? What's our great argument for the media?
So our group chose the media because we thought that the legislature has the most power in making laws, but the media is able to twist whatever the legislature does into their own way and make people believe that. And that way they have the power to set the agenda and discuss what they want to, or have whatever they want spoken about, reported upon. And they're not elected.
Okay, so they're not elected and they have all of this power to set the agenda of what the rest of government's going to work on.
You said it was a growing power as well.
A growing power, okay. Yes.
Also, I mean, in terms of practical power, technically the legislative branch and the executive branch have the most power because they have the armies, they have the military, you know.
Yeah.
But if you look at like two huge examples in U.S. history is the Vietnam War and World War II. One of the deciding factors in those two, like the deciding factor in those two wars, was not military power or the legislature branch or the executive branch. It was the media and how they rallied people's support.
Okay. Good. Yes. I feel like we've got some responses here, and those hands went up quick.
I would argue that's also another coordination problem, like the one instance where the media was totally unified, as opposed to like today where I can find any media and back myself.
Okay, so maybe there's too many opinions out there and we can't coordinate, so to wield that power? That's good.
So that's the reason why we were debating between media and judicial, and the reason why we didn't go with media is because while yes, they set the agenda, you have a million different sources all setting slightly different agendas, and it just depends on which ones people actually listen to.
Okay, great. There was another hand over here. Yes.
Well, I think like most people though listen to the loudest voices in the media, and that like even though maybe you have like a third of media outlets that are saying like, no, Trump's a great guy, most are saying they aren't, and most people don't like Donald Trump.
I think there's some polling data on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think the media is largely responsive to things that the executive and the legislature branches do, or the judicial branch.
Good.
I think a lot of it, I think they can set the agenda for sure, but at the same time, given the example of wars, you know, a lot of it's going to be reacting to acts of Congress or the President.
Good.
Iraq, a lot of the media was on board with that at first, and then as soon as we figured some things out, not so much. And that was largely a reaction to it.
Good. So this is a big argument that political scientists do have about the media. To what extent are they setting the agenda and directing what government is doing, and to what extent are they just responding to the events of government, and really they're the ones in charge? So that, you know, is the media proactive or reactionary is probably a big piece of how much power we think the media really has. It's a great answer.
I also think there's a huge, for politicians specifically, a huge self-interest of re-election and election. And so much of that, of their image or being able to be re-elected or elected in the first place is all framed by the media to appeal to constituents. And so potentially a politician is going to act a certain way so that they can be viewed by the media in a certain way so that they can win. And, you know, it's like this chain reaction that gives the media the power to almost determine who will or will not be elected. I know in the last election it was kind of mixed things up a little bit. And there were so many polls like, oh, Clinton's got it. She obviously did not win. But then Trump did also have power in the media with just his own personal use of media that really influenced how people voted.
Excellent. That's great. Let's move on to the executive branch. Who picked the executive branch? What's our argument there? Somebody picked the executive branch. We're not owning up to it anymore.
You picked the executive branch.
Okay, let's hear it.
Executive branch is the power of the sword. They have the.
Okay.
They have practical power.
Okay. So I heard this group talking a lot about faces of power, right? So yeah, they have military power in, you know, that first face of power. Yes.
Well, yeah, I think the thing is like for most policy making, if the legislative branch and the executive branch are against each other, they just end up gridlocked. But the executive branch can still kind of get around that with executive orders, with using the media.
Okay.
It's just easier to like circumvent the federal system in the executive branch.
Okay, great. So we've seen a lot of this behavior and a growing amount of this behavior over the last several presidencies. Not to point fingers at any one particular side, but as the coordination problems in Congress grow, the executive has more room to kind of step in and through executive orders direct the bureaucracy, the executive power, where normally the legislature would be making those decisions.
I just have a question.
Yes.
So, would the president using Twitter or something like that be considered media or executive?
That's a great question. What do you think? What do we think? Let's take a vote. Should we? Yeah? Okay. If you think the president using Twitter is media power, raise your hand.
like it's a convenient tool.
If you think the president using Twitter is presidential power, raise your hand. Good. Yeah, I think it's probably, he's using that particular media to reach the public, but I think it probably is still the president directing public opinion.
Okay. I mean, it's kind of like him giving a speech.
It's just a 140 character speech.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to do one last thing. One last little discussion. So let's think about today. Are there too many checks and balances? These are some thought questions. I'd like to get your reactions. There are not answers to these questions. Not definitive answers to these questions. So are there too many checks and balances? Does this whole elaborate system where we have power divided among all of these different branches make it too hard for government to get anything done? Are there checks and balances we think we could eliminate from the political system that might make things function better? Or has one branch become too powerful? I don't think we're going to come to that conclusion based on the division of arguments we've come with here. But do we need more checks and balances over a particular branch? And what might that look like? Does anybody have some thoughts on this? Yes?
I wouldn't say it's like too many checks and balances, but I do think that it is really hard, and I think that's what the founders set it up as. I think they were so nervous about like a tyrannical government or one branch having too much power that they set so many things that conflicted against each other that now with the way that we always are looking to the government and want policy change and some things faster than it's possible, it seems like it could be really slow and that there's too many. But it's hard to pinpoint for me like which ones would be the ones that I would take out. But I think in some instances it moves slower than we might want.
So maybe we might want it to go a little faster, but the founders wouldn't have. Okay, good.
I think, I don't know, I think it's Winston Churchill quote where he says, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others which have been invented so far. And I think like every kind of democratic system is going to have all these different problems. We have a very slow system. I think other systems are equally bad. I think the real problem is just that people are like not willing to compromise, people are fundamentally flawed, and that's why we have so many governmental problems. I think if we were to have better people voting, better people running, and people who are like more open to communicate and look at facts, then our government system would run much better.
So what I'm hearing there is that it's not a checks and balances problem, it's a mischief affections problem. Do you talk about that? Yeah, there are too many people who want too many different things, and we just can't get along enough to get anywhere.
I think people make the mistake too much of equating efficiency with good government. The most efficient form of government is a dictatorship.
Exactly.
And it's the worst. It's the worst form of government for freedom and whatnot. And so I don't think that having a lot of checks and balances necessarily means that our government's bad or that it's not the sort of government that we need. I think that if we got rid of any one of those branches of government, that would automatically give too much power to the remaining three branches of government, or the remaining
two branches of government and
the media, whatever, however you want to split that. That would give too much power to them, and then that would kind of change the balance to make it more into a dictatorship. So I think that all branches, even media, is necessary in their own way, and then if we remove any of it, it disrupts the balance. The careful balance has been achieved too much.
Okay, great. About this, anybody willing to stick their neck out for a check or a balance that we might remove? I'll throw one out there. Let's see what you think about this. What if we were to have the president appoint the Supreme Court without Congress's approval?
That's bad.
We are not okay with this. Okay. Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, well, I mean, like we were talking about FDR, and maybe he would have actually done that.
He sure tried.
Yeah. It's probably a good thing Congress stopped him.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't really think it would change too much. I mean, the president, could just go and appoint, a bunch of people who were in his party, but there aren't, 9 openings each time there's a president, so there's still,
Okay, it's still going to be incremental.
There's still a check on that.
Okay, yeah, that's a great example of another check we hadn't talked about yet. We'll go over here first.
The 9 people in the Supreme Court is not actually in the Constitution. That is tradition. And so, I mean, if presidents could, then they would probably, I mean, let's say that the Supreme Court's at 5 for something that the president doesn't want and 4 for something the president does want, then he could theoretically, without, the Congress overlooking him, he could just appoint 2 other people to the Supreme Court and say, now we have 11 members of the Supreme Court. So I think that the Congress checking that helps.
Okay. So what if we take court packing off the table? What if we say we fix it at 9? He can only appoint 9 people, but he doesn't have to have congressional approval to fill vacancies. Go. That's what
I agree. I don't think it would change much. I think you'd have a lot of 5-4 decisions, which we already have right now. So I think it'd just be a little more polarized.
Okay.
Well, just
Oh, you go for it.
sorry. Just kind of going back at the idea that it's not all 9 justices being turned out every new election. Even 1 seat on the bench is incredibly important. It's life.
So you think it's too important to let the president alone have power?
Right.
Okay, great. Yes, you've waited patiently.
Even with making it a little bit more polarized, I feel like that could be super dangerous because usually it's the moderate judge that ends up making the decision, and if the president doesn't need to check it with the Congress, we're going to have super polarized justices.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we saw an interesting case of this last year with the death of with Antonin Scalia, where you had President Obama who brought forth this compromise judge, let's work together, Senate and President, and then the Senate just didn't want to work with him at all. So I think just the way politics is right now, it is kind of more the Senate that's choosing who the justice is, because the president is choosing whoever the Senate would like. So if we were to allow the president to just choose whoever he wants, I don't think that would be especially bad. I think you just need to kind of have some base levels of qualifications, so it isn't just the president's friend
Your buddy.
or
Okay.
some guy who just barely passed the bar after getting an online law degree or something.
Yeah.
Okay. I think these are all really great arguments. I hope you've thought a lot about it. We will end there. Do you need any time to wrap things up? Okay. Thank you. You've all been wonderful. Good luck with your midterm.